talking about disaster recovery, basically. And so we'll be talking about some of the regulations and some of the other things that go along with that. A little bit about my company. Highmark Health is a blended health organization. And basically that encompasses, we have providers through hospitals like the Allegheny Health Network. We have population health management type stuff that we do, dental solutions, and of course insurance. We are a Blue Cross, Blue Shield group that provides a lot of insurance to mostly people in the Northeast. So that's kind of where we're at as far as the company. The disaster recovery imperative. Whenever you're dealing with health data, it's extremely important to make sure that it's always available and always ready to go. Because not only is it important for the patients to have their information available and our providers, we also have regulatory compliance that we have to follow. So you've got HIPAA regulations that govern, of course, the PHI, the personal health information, and PII. And we all know about HIPAA, so we've heard about that a lot. And that's one of the things that we have to follow. Now, HIPAA doesn't specifically tell you how you have to do a DR, but they do require that you conduct a regular health assessment as far as vulnerabilities and things that you need to make sure you're ready for. And this, in turn, helps, once we do those assessments, it helps us to determine the best way to do our disaster recovery processes and how we can make them more effective. At Highmark, we have what we call a warm DR environment. So it basically where we have an active Teradata system in another data center that we consistently move data to, but no one can access that data from the company. It's only sitting there ready to go in case of a DR. So in this case, our data center that we have, the main data center for our production systems in Pennsylvania, and then we have a DR center in New York. But we're getting ready to move the DR center to Virginia, so that's kind of a little bit of a nerve-wracking thing that we're going to be doing there, but that's something else. Our DR solution. Much of it was done before I got there, but we basically use Data Mover, which is a Teradata product, that we move the data from the production system over to our DR system. We do that generally on a weekly basis from our Pennsylvania data center to the New York data center. And this is kind of our environment. So we have our production system is a 16-node IntelliFlex 2.5, and we use Data Mover to move the data, but we have in the middle of that, we have a enterprise scheduling tool called Control-M. Now, it could be anything like Active Batch or Control-M could be used to do the same kind of thing. So Control-M schedules everything, and then it hits our bar server, which contains all of our Data Movers, code and scripts and everything. And that kicks off the Data Mover jobs on the system. And we do that on a weekly basis. So we push all that data over to the 12-node IntelliFlex 2.1 version, which may change when we do the move, because I think we're getting a new system when we move it to Virginia. As far as Data Mover, we currently have, we're fairly small compared to a lot of companies, so we currently only have 60 Data Mover jobs that cover 663 databases, and we're moving about 137 terabytes. We do that on a weekly basis, and we're averaging about 3,600 kilobytes per second when we run these jobs. Total runtime about 4.5 hours. And individual runtime of about 1 hour and 12 minutes. So these are all averages. Now you can end up having issues, things go wrong, and of course you see different things that happen. But that's kind of an example of what we do. You can see Control-M up at the top, and then of course the Data Mover portlet on Viewpoint. Now, this is a little bit misleading because it shouldn't say daily. It should have been weekly. So we run weekly jobs to compare because we run weekly jobs to move the data from the production to DR. So we also run weekly jobs that compare the metadata and the data between the two systems to make sure that we're current. The metadata gets moved generally when we have releases. If there's a release that has a new table or new columns or fields, all that gets pushed to DR as well as the production system. So we do that simultaneously. So that's not really affected by a data mover. And the data, we just move all the data over using data mover. I've moved along way too fast, but what we consider success is that we remain in compliance with federal and state requirements. And we make sure that we have all of the health information of our customers. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and in case of disaster recovery. So that's how we consider success. I guess we're to questions.
Hang on a second. I will get you a microphone. My microphone runner has disappeared on me.
Hi. Great presentation. Thank you, Evneet from PNC. We use something very similar. We've been talking just for the audience. And can you talk a little bit about, is there any validation that you guys do once you guys have moved the data from primary to?
We do. I touched on that briefly. We actually have automated jobs that basically run SQL to hit both of the systems to do the comparison. And it brings back and coalesces it into a report. We run the DR jobs every weekend to kind of minimize contention with all the other business activity that's going on. So on Mondays, we run that validation job and script. And it just queries the database on both sides, and it comes back and it compares everything and puts it all together in a report.
Does it compare like row by row, or is it more like row counts? Like what type of validation?
In some cases, it depends. In some cases, it's row by row. In some cases, it's just counts. It depends on the data and the database that we have. We have several reports that are generated that way.
Got it. One last comment or statement. Have you guys seen any limitations with using this, especially with, I'll give you an example. When we learned this the hard way, we implemented columnar tables, okay? Not knowing that the underlying protocol that we use, TPT, does not allow for multi-load or fast load to be leveraged with that, and our job would just keep running because it was streaming.
Right.
And so did you guys ever face any other issues, things like that?
I wish I could say that I knew the answer to that question, but we don't currently use columnar. We don't use a lot of the like geospatial, a lot of the capabilities that Teradata has. Unfortunately, our people have not decided to use those. So we're still kind of in the beginning stages of really trying to understand how best to use the Teradata system as far as analytics and the different types of things that we can do. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to push. I'm fairly new to the company, and I'm trying to push a little more toward the analytical side and some of the capabilities that Teradata has, because they never took advantage of those until I got there. So we're trying to do that. But I wish I could answer that question, but we just haven't seen it.
No, fair enough. Thank you.
Hi, Ron Gorman, Union Pacific Railroad. So I have a few questions. Can I have you go back a couple slides just as reference? Go back one more, I think. So you're using control. Are you running this on Data Mover is it on Teradata? Or are you using your own hardware on Linux or Windows?
We have Teradata provided bar servers that we run these on. And then Viewpoint connects to the bar servers.
I know. I didn't know if the servers that you have, the Data Mover specific server. You have your own specific data mover server.
Right, yeah, that's completely separate.
within the ecosystem.
Yeah, the data, Control M stuff is an enterprise system
Yeah.
that does a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's completely separate from our bar systems and setup.
But I was just wondering where your data mover is actually living. Is it on Teradata itself, or do you have data mover itself installed on a commodity hardware or company hardware?
It's all part of the package for
So it's-
the data streaming architecture, DSA.
Yep. So
And, and it's all controlled through Viewpoint in
Yep.
the data mover portlet. So everything is installed there on that
Yeah.
bar server.
We have it
We
too,
don't
but
have a separate server like you guys.
yeah, we have
Right.
we have separate servers on VMs.
Oh, okay.
So when you my real questions here are, so you copy once a week data. Is that, do you update how often do you update Teradata production tables to be, in other words, do you have a requirement from your DR team that says you have to be, so for example, our SLA is 24 hours.
Right.
So we actually do multiples of I don't get that kind of performance of 4.5 hours at 137. We have probably, it takes me almost all day, probably about a dozen or so more jobs than you do.
Right.
They're not all DSA. Some of them are TPT jobs that where we do updates, and then on the weekend we'll do a complete refresh of so our weekends are done with that because we do archiving, actual archiving of our production system to disk on weekends, so we can't do any this on the weekdays. So are you within that compliance, or is your compliance a little bit different for?
We are relying on the business to tell us what they can tolerate as far as the latency of the data. So it was decided that they could live with up to a week. And then if say, the disaster occurs and we're 2 days in or 3 days in to, the new loads that are on the production system, they can catch those up on the DR system themselves.
Okay.
So that we relied on the application teams and the business to tell us what exactly they needed. And we worked with them and tried to get the best possible solution. And running on the weekends allows us to get these things done without a lot of contention on the database.
Yes. Yeah. So you do, excuse me. So you do the full refresh. So if you have let's say a disaster on Friday, and you ran it let's say you run on Saturday. So they're going to go backwards and then reprocess files to load onto
The DR system.
to the DR system.
Yep.
Okay. So you do that. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, we do. We do not do that at all. And so it's 4.5 hours. That must be just the larger. And your DR is a dedicated system then?
It is. It is.
So there's no dev or test that runs on
Exactly.
That's probably
Yep.
why. Okay.
Totally dedicated.
All right. And then can you move to your next slide then, the one just right after it? Okay. So so this is something I'm also really interested in. So your counts that you do, you're just doing those through SQL in a report that run after it's done, and they're not going to be the same unless you do by date. So you say as of, for other words, so your current tables that you have in DR, you actually have to do that count and you match it to your production based off the date.
Yes.
From the date that you actually did it from. So in other words, almost right afterwards, you try to do a row count, and you may have some discrepancies if you have some sort of, loads or whatever that happen, but you just do essentially row counts. Would that be accurate to say?
Yes, exactly. And sometimes we do see discrepancies and we have to go in and investigate, but for the most part, because they run these validations so closely after we do the DR data mover jobs, it's generally pretty close. So we're pretty confident in it.
And do you work with your DBAs to make sure that, any table changes that are made, that they actually execute those on the DR as well. So, for example, let's say you retire a table, or maybe not retire a table. Let's say you do table change, or you retire a database, or rename a database, or something. That they have to perform those same duties on DR. Because if you have a job, let's say that does a single data mover job that does, let's say, 2 or 3 databases in it. Let's say it's 2 or 3 of your smaller ones that you do, and somebody makes that whole job fails. Because of how it's structured. It'll just, the minute it gets to those tables, the job will fail from a data mover side.
Right.
So So is that one of the things you brought in when you came in, of like, these changes that you implement in production also have to be implemented in DR?
Absolutely.
When it comes to table.
That's part of our release process.
Okay.
So it automatically, once we do all of the non-production stuff, we do the test systems, the QA systems, and all this stuff, all that goes through in the release. And then when we get ready to do production, we actually do those simultaneously. So the release goes to the DR system, exactly the same thing as happens in the production system.
Through that release system.
Yep.
Okay. And I think and so you copy metadata over too as well. And what's the reason for that?
Well, that's so that we can kind of keep those things in sync as well, so people understand when they look at the metadata, they can see what's out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Well, in that case, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.